"Get the hell out of my garage, you poor black trash. Do you think you're a doctor?" Harlan screamed straight into Leroy Jenkins's face, then hurled the termination contract into his chest, while the ambulance was still flashing its lights in the middle of a sky-ripping rainstorm. A single mechanic, who had just bent over to repair a vehicle to save a stranger's life, was thrown out like a piece of excess garbage. No thanks. No one stood up for him. The only thing Leroy managed to keep was a blood-stained brake-locking bolt shoved deep into his pocket, a tiny piece of evidence that the entire system wanted to make disappear. But just a few seconds later, in that exact fragile moment, everything flipped. The engine roared. The ambulance sped off through the rain. The patient survived, and Leroy realized something that sent a chill down his spine. That vehicle had never been damaged by an accident. The brake line had been cut at an angle. The locking bolt had been twisted the wrong way, a form of subtle sabotage, precise enough to kill without knives or guns. Someone had arranged everything, from the route to that deadly timing. Then the truth came crashing down like a hammer. The woman who nearly died in the rain that night was not an ordinary person. She was the chief executive officer of an automobile company worth tens of millions of dollars, someone who was supposed to die from pre-existing medical conditions before she ever had the chance to speak. So, what is the question? Who wanted her to die in silence? Why was a poor mechanic fired immediately after saving a life? Why was his daughter's life suddenly delayed by procedure? If you were Leroy, standing before power, money, and your child's fragile heart, would you stand up or bow your head to survive? Comment with your choice. Follow the channel, because this story is not just about saving a life, but about exposing a system that kills through silence. Birmingham, Alabama still hangs the word progress on every street, but this city has never stopped learning how to suffocate people politely. Racism no longer appears in ropes or screaming mobs. It hides inside contracts, clauses, procedures, and smiling handshakes. Here, people of color do not die from open hatred. They die from delays, from being replaced, from being forced into silence just to keep breathing. Harlan Vance's garage sat right beside the highway, an aging concrete block absorbing exhaust fumes and acid rain. The smell of motor oil seeped into the walls, the floor, and even into the words spoken there every day. Leroy Jenkins had worked there for 10 years. 45 years old, black, a skilled mechanic, a single father. He arrived at the garage when the air was still heavy with dawn mist, and left when the city had already sunk into darkness. In those 10 years, no one promoted him, and no one ever asked what he wanted. The only question he was asked was whether he would work overtime or quit. Harlan stepped out of the small office behind the garage, his shoes cleaner than the concrete floor. He looked at Leroy with that familiar gaze, the gaze of someone who owned everything within this space. "I pay you here to work, not to think," Harlan said, his voice even and cold. The words were released lightly as air, but they carried the authority of the man who controlled the payroll. Leroy bent back over the car he was fixing, his hand tightening around the wrench. He did not answer. He had learned that reacting here only created more trouble. Harlan turned to the group of younger mechanics standing nearby and curled his lip. One of them snorted, glanced at Leroy, and muttered loudly enough for the entire garage to hear, "This old black guy must be used to working in the shadows." Scattered laughter followed, short and dry. The dirtiest shifts always belonged to Leroy. Night shifts, rain shifts, heavy jobs. No overtime paperwork, no name on the bonus board. When he asked about extra hours, Harlan waved a hand dismissively. "Garage culture," he said. "Can't handle it? Then quit. Plenty of people out there are cheaper than you." That culture allowed time cards to be altered, allowed humiliation to be called a joke, and allowed people to be crushed without ever laying a hand on them. At the end of the shift, Leroy stood in front of the time clock. His recorded hours had been changed, the markings scraped away and rewritten. He held the pen and signed his name. Each stroke of ink meant accepting less, but it also meant another week of heart medication for his daughter. He reminded himself of that to swallow the tightness in his throat. At the hospital, Leroy's daughter lay in bed under cold white lights. The heart monitor released steady, fragile beeps. The doctor pulled a chair closer and spoke softly, as if afraid to shatter the air. Her congenital heart condition is progressing faster than expected. If the surgery is delayed another few months, I cannot promise anything. Leroy nodded, thanked him, and stood up. In his hands was a thick stack of bills. The figures blurred before his eyes, making his hands tremble. He whispered, just loud enough for himself to hear, "I just need her to live." Back at the garage, the sky began to darken. The clouds hung low and heavy, the wind carrying a metallic smell. Thunder split across the Birmingham sky, rattling the window glass. The garage closed early because of the storm, but Leroy stayed. Harlan had made it clear, anyone who stays does so at their own risk. Leroy stayed for a few extra hours, unpaid. He wiped his hands and bent beneath a car as the rain hammered harder and harder against the metal roof. In a rare, quiet moment between waves of rain, Leroy thought of his daughter. He pictured her tired smile when she woke after each examination. That image kept him standing. He did not need heroism, only enough money to buy time. A violent crash echoed from the highway, slicing through his thoughts. The sound of metal slamming into metal, followed by the shredded scream of sudden braking. Leroy lifted his head, his heart pounding. A flash of blue and red light pierced the curtain of rain, reflecting off the garage windows. The doors shook violently, as if the entire concrete block were being dragged toward the road. Leroy ran outside, rain lashing his face. In front of him, an ambulance had skidded sideways, its front crushed, one wheel spinning uselessly. The lights blinked through the rain, the siren choking as if gasping for breath. The rear doors burst open, and a doctor jumped out, his face drained of color. "Is anyone here?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "We need help now." Leroy stepped closer and looked inside. A female patient lay motionless, her chest rising with difficulty. The doctor leaned in and spoke fast. "Cardiac arrhythmia, blood pressure dropping. If this vehicle does not move again within minutes, she will not survive." Rain poured down, swallowing every other sound. Leroy felt every beat of his own heart. He turned back toward the garage, its lights flickering weakly. The doors shook again as the wind intensified. In that moment, everything he had known for 10 years shifted color. The garage was no longer the place he endured each day, but a fragile boundary between life and death. Blue and red lights stretched across the wet concrete floor like a crack. The doctor looked at Leroy, waiting. From a distance, thunder rolled again, deep and heavy. The garage doors rattled once more, so violently that the bolts in the frame clicked and clattered. The ambulance slid another short distance, as if pushed by an invisible force. Rain and flashing lights blended, turning the old garage into an unwilling stage for a moment that Leroy had no idea would change everything. The ambulance skidded across the flooded road and slammed hard into the edge of the garage, its body shuddering violently before coming to a complete stop. The red and blue lights continued flashing in the rain, reflecting off oily puddles spreading across the concrete floor. The siren cut in and out, as if the vehicle itself were running out of breath. Leroy froze for a second, then rushed forward as the rear doors burst open. The doctor jumped down, his shoes slipping on the wet ground. He leaned close to Leroy, his voice distorted by wind and panic. "If this vehicle doesn't run again within 5 minutes, she dies. I have no other choice." He pointed into the compartment where a woman lay motionless, her chest rising and falling irregularly. Each breath seemed torn apart by the sound of the rain. Leroy glanced his eyes, sweeping past the cables, the oxygen tank, then stopping on the patient's pale face. He turned back to the doctor. "Who called the ambulance?" he asked. "We received an urgent dispatch order," the doctor replied, unable to hide his confusion. "The route was changed at the last minute. I only knew I had to drive as fast as possible." A bolt of lightning tore across the sky, clearly illuminating the crushed front of the vehicle. Leroy ran to the front and opened the hood. The lightning swept over every metal detail, leaving nothing hidden. His gaze suddenly halted. His hand froze in midair, then slowly lowered, as if touching something that should not exist. He leaned in closer. The brake line sat out of its normal position, not from a violent impact. It had been cut carefully, enough to make the vehicle lose control after several braking attempts, enough to cause an accident without leaving crude traces. Leroy swallowed hard, a chill running down his spine. He pulled more light from the garage lamp, shining deeper inside. The locking bolts in the brake assembly had been reversed, the wear marks showing they had been tampered with beforehand. Leroy murmured, his voice so low He nearly could not hear himself. "This can't be an accident," he repeated the sentence as if to confirm it to himself. Years as a mechanic had given him enough experience to distinguish between error and intent. This was the tent calculated to delay, to create a prolonged chain of failures. The doctor stood behind him, his voice trembling. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "We're losing time." Leroy turned around, his expression grave. "Someone sabotaged this vehicle," he said. "It wasn't an accident." The doctor stiffened. "Sabotaged?" he repeated. "Are you sure?" Leroy nodded. "I'm sure." Another voice cut in, dry and cold, slicing through the exchange. "No." Leroy spun around. Harlan Vance stood at the edge of the garage, under the canopy, his coat inexplicably dry amid the pouring rain. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze resting on the ambulance as if taking inventory of newly delivered goods. "Close the hood," Harlan said, his voice calm and firm. "This isn't your business." Leroy straightened up. "Someone is about to die," he replied. "This vehicle needs to be fixed immediately." Harlan curled his lip. "I already told you," he answered. "Around here you follow orders, not emotions." The doctor stepped forward. "You don't understand," he said, trying to stay calm. "My patient needs to be transported right now." Harlan turned to him, his eyes icy. "I understand very clearly," he replied. "And I also understand my authority on this land." He glanced at Leroy. "Get back to your work." Leroy looked back into the compartment. The patient began convulsing, the monitoring machine emitting rapid, urgent sounds. The doctor bent down, trying to stabilize her condition. "We're losing time," he said, his voice higher with desperation. "You're the mechanic. You can see it most clearly." Leroy felt both pairs of eyes pressing down on him. Harlan stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Leroy could hear. "Do you know what this leads to?" he asked. "I don't want trouble." "Neither do you." Leroy looked straight at him. "Trouble is letting someone die right in front of us," he replied. Harlan gave a thin smile. "If she dies from underlying medical conditions, who can be blamed?" he said, then turned to the doctor. "This is an unforeseen accident. Handle it according to procedure." The doctor clenched his fists. "Procedure won't save her," he said. "This vehicle needs to run." Harlan waved his hand. "I do not permit any repairs," he replied. "Property on my land. I decide." "It's C." Leroy turned back to the open hood, his hand resting on the icy metal edge. He examined the sabotage marks once more, clear and deliberate. In his mind, the pieces began to fit together. The route change, the storm timing, and the vehicle Dawer managed just enough to cause an accident, but not destruction. Everything had been arranged to prolong time, to manufacture a death that looked reasonable. He lifted his head, looking past Harlan's shoulder into the murky curtain of rain. "Someone wanted this vehicle to stop," he said slowly, "and wanted it to stop long enough." Harlan did not answer immediately. His eyes flickered briefly, then returned to Leroy. "You're overthinking it," he replied. "Do your job." The doctor cut in, his voice sharper. "I don't care who wants what," he said. "I only know my patient is dying." Harlan looked at him, the smile gone. "Then you should call another ambulance," he said. "If there's still time, his regrets." Leroy looked back at the patient once more. The convulsions were stronger, her breathing broken. He felt a heavy pressure on his chest. He turned to Harlan. "You're carrying something in this vehicle," Leroy said, "and you're afraid of it going any farther." Harlan stepped in close, his voice dropping. "You're crossing the line," he said. "Close the hood." Thunder roared again, close and heavy. Rain pounded down on the garage roof, drowning out every other sound. Leroy stood between the wide-open hood and the flickering red and blue lights, staring at the patient struggling inside the compartment. A clear thought slowly took shape. This ambulance had never been meant to save anyone. It had been prepared to stop, to delay, to let a life slip away in silence. And at this very moment, someone was making sure it would never run again. Harlan yanked hard on Leroy's arm, pulling him away from the ambulance whose lights were flashing in the rain. His grip was firm, accustomed to giving orders rather than persuading. He shoved Leroy back against the damp, cold concrete wall of the garage, where the sound of rain and the blare of horns from the highway merged into a dense, suffocating noise. Harlan lowered his voice, but it was sharp and precise, like a well-honed blade. "Do you know what fixing this vehicle means?" Leroy looked him straight in the face. Rainwater ran down the bridge of his nose, dripping onto his bitter, salty lips. "Someone will die if it's not fixed," he replied. His voice was neither loud nor trembling. It was a simple sentence, spoken by someone accustomed to living with consequences. Harlan laughed, a dry, short laugh, as if he had just heard something naively ridiculous. "Death comes with a death certificate," he said. "I've got contracts." He emphasized the last two words, as if they were a talisman for every filthy thing he was doing. Harlan glanced toward the ambulance compartment, his eyes wary and calculating. "There are things that shouldn't reach a hospital too early," he continued, his voice dropping. "The slower, the better, for a lot of people." Leroy felt his stomach tighten. He turned his head to look inside the vehicle. The woman on the stretcher was convulsing more violently. The doctor bent close, urgently calling her name, trying to maintain her breathing and heart rhythm. Rain hammered against the roof, blending with the heart monitor's erratic beeping. Acting on professional instinct, Leroy stepped forward, his hand already reaching out, but Harlan immediately blocked him. Harlan leaned close to Leroy's ear. His breath was dry, the smell of cold coffee and cigarettes clinging to every whispered word. "Touch that vehicle," he said slowly, each word chosen with care. He paused, long enough for Leroy to understand that what followed was not meant for anyone else to hear. "And your child won't have money for heart surgery." The sentence dropped like a heavy block of metal. Leroy stood frozen. For a moment, all surrounding sounds seemed to recede. He could clearly hear his own heartbeat, uneven, blending with the woman's arrhythmic heartbeat in the ambulance, and the thunder crashing over the city. Harlan straightened up, locking eyes with Leroy to make sure the threat had landed where it was meant to. The doctor turned toward them, not fully understanding the exchange but sensing the tension. "What's going on?" he asked. "We need the vehicle fixed immediately." Harlan did not bother to look at him. "I've made myself clear," he replied. "There will be no repairs here." Leroy swallowed. The image of his daughter rose before him with painful clarity. The little girl lay on a hospital bed, her small chest rising and falling beneath wires and machines. He remembered the feel of her hand gripping his whenever she was afraid, remembered the way she looked at him as if he were the only thing anchoring her to this world. He also remembered the stack of bills, remembered the doctor's voice talking about a surgery that needed to be done soon. Harlan tilted his head, his voice turning colder. "I'm not forcing you," he said. "I'm giving you a choice." He pointed toward the ambulance compartment, then jabbed a finger at Leroy's chest. "That stranger," he said, "or your child." Leroy felt his throat dry out. He looked back into the vehicle. The doctor lifted his head, his eyes pleading. "You're the only one who can help," he said. "I don't care about contracts or these dirty games. I only know that if this vehicle doesn't move, she will die here." Harlan laughed again, this time without hiding his contempt. "You hear that?" he said to Leroy. "Everyone has their reasons, but mine are always signed and stamped." He stepped back, as if his part was finished. "Think it over," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." Ebel, end quote. The rain poured down harder. The wind howled, making the garage doors shudder. Leroy stood between two worlds. On one side, the ambulance, with its flickering red and blue lights. On the other, the familiar darkness of the garage and the threat that had just been planted in his mind. He felt the choice gnawing at him from the inside. He turned back to Harlan. "You're carrying something in that vehicle," Leroy said in a low voice, "and you're afraid of it going any farther." Harlan curled his lip. "You don't need to know," he replied. "You just need to remember who you're feeding." The heart monitor inside the ambulance began beeping more rapidly, then slowed terrifyingly. The doctor shouted, calling to Leroy. "Please," he said, "we're about to lose her." Leroy took another step forward, then stopped. His hand trembled, not from the cold rain. Harlan watched the scene with the calm of someone accustomed to standing atop other people's choices. "Your time isn't much," he said, "just like hers." At that moment, a dull explosion sounded from somewhere behind the garage. The ceiling lights flickered once, then went out completely. The entire garage plunged into darkness. The red and blue lights from the ambulance became the only source of illumination, flashing violently in the rain. The sounds of the machines inside the vehicle grew clearer, more naked. Harlan turned his back, not needing to look anymore. "I've said my piece," he said, his voice fading into the sound of the rain. He walked away, his figure dissolving into the gray curtain of water. The garage door closed behind him, leaving Leroy alone. Leroy stood motionless between darkness and flashing light. In front of him was a life slipping away second by second. Behind him was a threat bound to his daughter's fragile heart. Thunder rolled again, heavy and ominous, like a reminder that this choice would not disappear, whether he turned away or stepped forward. Darkness settled over the garage like a layer of thick liquid. The blue and red lights from the ambulance became the only source of illumination, flickering and distorted, stretching trembling shadows across the wet concrete floor. Rain continued to pound against the metal roof in heavy waves, making the entire space vibrate in rhythm. Leroy stood motionless in the middle of that pool of light, feeling as though the whole world had been reduced to the exact spot where he was standing. Inside the vehicle, the woman gasped for breath, each inhale broken and uneven. The doctor leaned in close, his hands trembling as he adjusted the equipment. He looked up at Leroy, his eyes bloodshot, his voice breaking under the strain. "Please," he said, no longer able to maintain professional distance. "I can't keep her alive any longer." Leroy did not answer right away. He lowered his head and looked at his hands. The skin was hardened by grease and metal, old scratches layered over new ones. Cold rain seeped into every crease of his fingers, making them tremble, partly from the chill, partly from the fear rising uncontrollably inside him. He knew this feeling well. It was the feeling of every familiar path being cut off. In his mind, an image flashed, clear and painful. His daughter lay on a hospital bed, her small chest rising and falling beneath white lights, wires, and monitors surrounding her. He remembered the steady beeping of the heart monitor, remembered how she tried to smile whenever she saw him, as if she were the one trying to reassure him. The image carried no words, but it was powerful enough to pull him back into the present. The doctor's voice rang out again, more urgent now. "Please," he said, "you're the only one here." Leroy took a deep breath, feeling the cold, damp air flood his lungs. When he spoke, his voice was low but firm. "Open the trunk," he said. "Get a flashlight." The doctor froze for a moment, as if he could not believe what he had just heard. "You're really going to do this?" he asked, his voice caught between hope and fear. Leroy nodded, without turning around. "We don't have time," he said. "If we hesitate, she'll die here." The doctor hurried to comply. The flashlight snapped on, a narrow beam sweeping through the vehicle compartment before pointing toward the front. Leroy stepped forward and knelt in front of the wide-open engine. Darkness concealed most of the details, but even with the weak light, he could still see what he needed to see. He leaned in close, placing his hand on the cold metal, feeling every faint vibration of the dying vehicle. "Are you sure?" the doctor asked again from behind him. Leroy did not look up. "If I don't fix it," he replied, his voice deep and steady, "I won't be able to live with myself." The words fell into the space between them, needing no further explanation. Thunder cracked loudly, so close that the ground seemed to shake. Rain lashed sideways, and strong wind made the flashlight beam wobble. Leroy planted his knee firmly on the floor to steady himself and began loosening the locking bolt. The metal was slick with water, his hands tightening as force traveled through his wrists. A small screech sounded as the bolt began to move. A sharp pain shot through his hand as the edge of the metal sliced into his skin. Blood seeped out, mixing with rainwater and oil, dripping onto the floor. Leroy did not stop. He clenched his teeth and kept turning. In that moment, he did not think about contracts, nor about the threat that had just been planted in his mind. He focused only on each movement, each mechanical detail, slowly returning to its proper place. The doctor stood nearby, holding the flashlight, breathing hard. "Her heart rate is dropping," he reported. "We're about to lose HR," Leroy responded with a brief nod. "One more minute," he said. "Keep her awake." Thunder rolled again, long and heavy. Rain hammered down on the garage roof, as if being poured out. Leroy felt the warmth of blood on his hand, but his movements remained precise. He tightened the locking bolt, adjusted the brake line, each motion familiar, as if he were working on an ordinary day. The only difference was that the darkness was thicker, and time was counting down. Finally, he slid out from beneath the vehicle and quickly wiped his hands on his pants. "Try it," he said. The doctor rushed to the cabin and turned the key. A second of silence stretched on, then the engine shuddered. The first sound was uneven, hoarse, and heavy, but it gradually stabilized. The engine started. The doctor shouted, unable to hide his relief. "All right," he said loudly, as if he needed to hear his own voice to believe it. "We're going." He slammed the door shut and signaled to the driver. The ambulance rolled forward, then accelerated, bursting out of the garage, its blue and red lights stretching into streaks through the rain. Leroy stood watching, his breath coming fast. As the vehicle faded onto the highway, the strength seemed to drain out of him. He stepped back once, then again, his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the wet concrete floor, his back against the cold wall. His breathing was ragged, each breath clawing at his chest. Rain continued to pour, and wind continued to whistle through the gaps. The garage fell back into darkness, strangely empty. Only Leroy remained, sitting there with hands smeared with blood and oil, his eyes fixed on the space where the vehicle had disappeared. He felt no relief, no sense of victory. There was only a hollow feeling, as if he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Outside, the ambulance raced through the rain at full speed, carrying a life that had just been pulled back from the edge. In the old garage, Leroy lowered his head, his breathing slowly steadying. He knew that whatever happened next, this moment had carved itself deeply into his life. There was no background music, no halo of glory. There was only a decision made in the dark, and the price of it would soon be paid. The next morning, Birmingham appeared under pale sunlight, as if the storm from the night before had never existed. The highway gradually dried, cars once again lined up bumper to bumper, and the city resumed its familiar rhythm. There was no news report mentioning an ambulance that had nearly lost control. There was no line of text saying that a human life had just been saved by a hair's breadth. The rainy night passed like a minor error, and errors are always erased from the records. Harlan's garage opened right on time. The smell of motor oil was the same as ever, the concrete floor still blotched with old stains. Leroy arrived earlier than usual. His hands were still aching, the cut from yesterday roughly bandaged, soaked with dried blood. He hung his jacket on the hook and quietly stepped into the repair area, just as he had done for 10 years. No one looked at him for more than a second. Their eyes slid past and then turned away, as if he were carrying something contagious. Harlan emerged from the back office, holding a sheet of paper in his hand. He did not beat around the bush. He walked straight to the central workbench in the garage, where everyone could see. Harlan slammed the paper down on the table in front of Leroy, the sound of paper hitting wood sharp and dry. "You're fired for damaging property," he said, his voice flat, neither raised nor lowered, as if he were reading from a pre-written clause. Leroy stood frozen. He looked at the paper, then raised his eyes to Harlan. "I saved someone," he said. The words came out faster than he expected, without pleading, just a bare fact. Harlan waved his hand, cutting him off. "There is no saving anyone here," he replied. "Only violations." He pointed at the line on the paper. "You interfered with a vehicle that was not under your repair authority, caused property damage. That's enough." A heavy silence settled over the garage. The other mechanics stood around, eyes fixed on the floor, hands busy with tasks that did not really exist. No one spoke. No one asked what had happened the night before. That silence was so familiar, it was almost part of the air itself. Leroy looked around, searching for a single pair of eyes, but found only bowed heads. He understood. In this place, speaking up meant losing your job. Losing your job meant losing everything. He turned back to Harlan. "Someone almost died," he said. "You know that." Harlan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't get it wrong," he said. "I know exactly what I need to know." He leaned in even closer, close enough that only Leroy could hear. "Open your mouth," Harlan said slowly, "and your last 3 months of pay disappear." He paused, staring straight into Leroy's eyes. "You need that money more than you think." Leroy did not answer. He picked up the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it back on the table. He did not tear it. He did not throw it. He turned and walked toward his locker. His tool bag lay there, lighter than it had ever felt. He put a few familiar items into the bag, things he had bought with his own money, things no one could take away. When he turned back, no one stopped him. He stepped out of the garage, sunlight shining straight into his eyes. The metal door closed behind him with a dull clang. 10 years of work ended on an ordinary morning like this. No goodbyes. No exclamation mark. On the drive home, Leroy drove more slowly than usual. The city drifted past the window. Familiar shops, gas stations, billboards, everything was still there. Only his place in it was gone. He stopped in front of his small house and sat still for a moment before opening the door. His phone vibrated just as he set his tool bag down on the floor. The hospital number appeared on the screen. His heart sank. He answered. "Hello, Mr. Jenkins," the voice on the other end said. "We have reviewed the test results again." Leroy leaned against the wall, gripping the phone tightly. "Your child's surgery needs to happen sooner than expected," the voice continued. "We cannot delay much longer." "How long?" Leroy asked. "We will contact you again with a specific schedule," the person replied, "but you need to prepare financially and mentally." The call ended. Leroy lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen. The numbers in his head began to race, fast and chaotic. Savings, final paycheck, bills, surgery, everything collapsed into a heavy mass, pressing against his chest. He stepped outside and sat down on the front steps. The sun was out, but the wind carried the familiar chill of the rainy night. He placed his hands on his knees and bowed his head. The street was quiet. A few children ran past, their laughter sounding distant and strange. Leroy thought about the ambulance, thought about the red and blue lights in the rain, thought about the woman lying motionless on the stretcher. He did not know whether she lived or died. No one called him to say thank you. No one called to ask anything more. As if he had never existed in that story at all, a sense of unease crept into him, slowly but unmistakably. That rainy night had not ended with the storm. It left behind unanswered questions, details that did not align. The rerouted road, the damaged vehicle, Harlan's overly quick reaction. Everything connected in a way he could not dismiss. Leroy lifted his head and looked out at the road in front of his house. Sunlight reflected off the pavement, bright but cold. He understood that losing his job was only the beginning. Something larger was moving beneath the calm surface of this city, and whether he wanted it or not, he had touched it on that rainy night. He stood up and carried his tool bag back into the house. The door closed, leaving the steps empty. Inside, Leroy, one certainty slowly took shape. He had saved a life, and the price had just begun to be paid. That rainy night was not over. It was only waiting for the moment to return, clearer and more ruthless than before. A few days passed after the dismissal, and Birmingham returned to the familiar quiet of a city that had always been skilled at hiding its cracks. Leroy spent most of his time in front of the house, bent over the old car that had been with him for many years. It was the only means of taking his daughter to the hospital, and also the thing he hoped he could fix up to earn a few spare dollars while he had not yet found a new job. The familiar smell of engine oil helped him keep his mind clear, preventing the memories of the rainy night from coming back too vividly. He was tightening a bolt when he heard footsteps stop behind him. Leroy raised his head instinctively. A woman stood a few steps away, calm in demeanor, with no bodyguards accompanying her, and carrying none of the usual signs of someone who had come to ask for help or to give thanks. She looked into the wide-open engine bay, her gaze focused and meticulous beyond what was ordinary. "Why did you know the brake line had been cut?" she asked, her voice direct, without any preamble. Leroy paused. He wiped his hands on a rag and straightened up. "Because it could not break like that," he replied. "An accident leaves different traces. That was not one." The woman nodded slightly, as if the answer confirmed something she already knew. She stepped one pace closer, her eyes still fixed on the engine. "Why did you dare to repair it during a power outage?" she continued. Her voice was cold and even, carrying none of the usual curiosity. Leroy bent down and went back to his work, not looking up. "Because if I did not fix it," he said, "someone would die." The answer was simple, needing no further explanation. The woman fell silent. The silence lasted longer than what courtesy normally required, long enough for Leroy to feel the air around them shift. He could clearly hear the sound of cars passing on the street, birds perched on power lines, and even his own breathing. She did not interrupt or cut in, merely standing there as if weighing something larger than a chance conversation. Finally, she spoke. "I am the one who was lying in that car." Her voice was lower, not loud, but it carried a weight that made Leroy jerk his head up. His eyes stopped on her face, searching for a sign that this was some kind of mistake. There was none. She looked straight at him, without avoidance. "And I am Eleanor Vance," she continued, each word pronounced clearly, "the chief executive officer of Vance Motors." The space in front of Leroy's house seemed to shrink. He stood motionless, his hand clenched tightly around the wrench. That name was bound to the old garage, to Harlan, to the 10 years he had worked in silence. "What did you come here for?" Leroy asked, his voice turning hoarse. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She looked around, as if assessing the neighborhood, the small house, the old car. "I did not come to thank you," she said. "I came to understand what happened." She looked back at Leroy. "I did not call an ambulance that night." Leroy frowned. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I was on my way to a meeting," Eleanor said. "A meeting related to terminating several dirty logistics contracts within my company." She paused briefly. "I had a heart attack on the road. When I woke up in the hospital, I only then learned that I had been taken there by ambulance." She continued, her voice steady and clear. "That vehicle was not part of the usual emergency route. The route was changed at the last minute, leading past Harlan's garage. The emergency call was made from an internal number, not mine." Eleanor looked at Leroy, her gaze sharpening. "Everything fits together far too perfectly." Leroy felt a chill run down his spine. The details he had tried to push aside began to surface clearly. The altered route, the sabotaged car, and Harlan's reaction. "If that car had not run again," Eleanor went on, "I would have died from an underlying medical condition. No criminal investigation, no suspect. Everything would have ended very neatly." "And you think," Leroy said slowly, "that was not a coincidence?" Eleanor nodded. "I began to think so when I reviewed the records," she said. "Then, I heard about a mechanic who repaired a car in the rain, in defiance of an order." She looked straight at him. "I wanted to meet that person." Leroy clenched his fist. He remembered Harlan's eyes that night, remembered the threat about his daughter's heart surgery money. He remembered the way Harlan had stood there, looking at the car, as if it were merchandise that needed to be preserved. "Someone wanted you dead," Leroy said, "and he used the system to do it." "Yes," Eleanor replied, "and that person did not act alone." She did not name anyone, but Leroy understood. That system was bigger than a single garage, bigger than one man who watched over cars. The air between them grew heavy. Leroy looked down at his hands, still marked with small scars from the rainy night. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Eleanor did not answer that question right away. She looked at the engine of the old car, then back at Leroy. "You saw something that should not exist," she said. "You fixed it, and because of that, you are still alive." She paused. "And so am I." The final pieces clicked into place in Leroy's mind. That rainy night had not been a random accident. It had been part of a plan, designed to kill someone without leaving traces, and his action had broken that plan. He lifted his head, his eyes darkening. "So," he said, "I did not just save a life." Eleanor looked at him and nodded very slightly. "You ruined a perfect murder." Leroy clenched his hands until his knuckles turned white. He looked out at the road in front of his house, where everything still appeared normal, still peaceful. But he knew clearly that beneath the surface, things were moving. That rainy night had never truly ended. It had only changed form. Before leaving, Eleanor added one more sentence, more a confirmation than a promise. "The truth does not want to die," she said. "The question is, who dares to let it live?" Leroy remained standing alone, the engine of the old car now silent. In his mind, everything had become frighteningly clear. He was no longer just a mechanic who had accidentally saved someone. He was a witness to a conspiracy concealed by procedure and power. And from this moment on, he understood that the road ahead would not allow him to return to being someone who stood on the outside. Eleanor Vance did not hurry to leave after speaking the truth. She invited Leroy inside the house, where it was quieter, and away from the curious eyes of the neighbors. Leroy brewed coffee, his hands still carrying the smell of engine oil. He set 2 cups on the table and sat across from the woman who had entered his life in a way no one could have prepared for. Eleanor spoke first, without detours. "I do not need you to be a hero," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need you to tell the truth." Her eyes were not searching for sympathy, but for clarity. Leroy leaned back in his chair and took a slow breath. "The truth does not pay hospital bills," he replied, his voice hoarse after days of strain. "My daughter needs heart surgery. I just lost my job. What exactly are you asking me to choose?" Eleanor nodded as if she had expected this. She pulled the bag beside her chair closer and placed a thick file on the table. "This is what I have, she said. Roots, dispatch orders, call logs, internal signatures, but courts do not trust paperwork when there are no people behind it. She slid the file toward Leroy. They need someone who was there. Leroy opened the folder and flipped quickly through the pages. The dry lines of text were stacked neatly, but to him, they were no longer lifeless. He recognized timestamps, familiar routes, and names of departments he had heard of but never touched. He stopped at one page and whispered, as if speaking to himself, "Someone wanted you dead." Eleanor nodded. "Marcus Hale," she said, "my chief operating officer." She did not emphasize the title, but it carried its own weight. He runs logistics, approves budgets, and controls transport contracts. If I had died that night, he would have triggered the emergency clause and taken control while the board was still reacting. Leroy set the folder down, his fingers tightening. "And Harlan?" he asked. "He knew the vehicle had been sabotaged. He threatened me on the spot." "Just a gatekeeper," Eleanor replied coldly. "Guarding vehicles, guarding silence. He has done it for years." She looked at Leroy. "People like him do not ask questions. They collect their fee and follow orders." In the small kitchen, the wall clock ticked steadily. Leroy looked down at his hands, old and new scars layered together. "You want me to testify," he said. "You know what that will bring." Eleanor did not avoid it. "I know," she said. "I also know you are being suffocated. I promise nothing but the truth." She paused briefly. "But if you stay silent, he will continue. Today it is me. Tomorrow, it will be someone else. This system kills people through procedure, and it needs silence to function." Leroy stood up and walked a few steps across the room. He looked out the window at the street in front of the house, calm to the point of feeling artificial. "You talk as if this is only about right and wrong," he said, "but I am raising a child. One statement could take away my daughter's chance to live." Eleanor stood as well, keeping her distance. "I am not bargaining with your child," she said. "I need you to consider something else. If Marcus Hale gets away, he will not stop at threats. He will erase evidence. You are evidence." She spoke slowly, clearly, so that Leroy understood every word. Leroy turned back and looked directly at her. "Will you protect me?" he asked. "Will you protect my daughter?" Eleanor was silent for a moment. "I will use everything I have within the law," she said. "Lawyers, the press, independent committees. But I cannot shield you if you choose silence. Silence is where they are strongest." Leroy remembered Harlan's words on the rainy night, remembered his eyes when he spoke about surgery money. He remembered the morning he was fired, the bowed heads in the garage. "If I testify," he said, "I become a target." "You already are," Eleanor replied, "from the moment you fixed that vehicle." Leroy sat back down and placed his hands on the table. The coffee had gone cold. "I do not want to be a hero," he said, repeating her own words. "I just want my child to live." Eleanor looked at him, her gaze softer but still resolute. "The truth may not pay hospital bills," she said, "but silence will take far more than that." 9. Outside, cars passed by. Wind rustled through the air. Time moved slowly, heavily. Leroy opened the folder again and read more carefully. He began to see the pieces fitting together on their own. A route changed at the last minute, a hastily signed dispatch order, a vehicle sabotaged just enough to cause a failure without raising suspicion. "He planned it carefully," Leroy said. "If I had not fixed it, you would have died, and everything would have looked like a heart attack on the road. Well, this plays." Eleanor nodded. "And because you fixed it," she said, "that plan collapsed." She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You are a living witness. No one else can say what you saw." Leroy closed his eyes for a moment. His daughter's image appeared, her fragile yet stubborn smile. He opened his eyes and looked at Eleanor. "I need time," he said. "Time is what Marcus Hale is buying with procedure," Eleanor replied, "and he buys it very well." Silence settled over the kitchen once more. Finally, Eleanor picked up her bag and prepared to leave. Before stepping out the door, she turned back to look at Leroy. "You testify," she said decisively, "or he will keep killing through procedure." The door closed. Leroy stood alone, his hand resting on the folder. He understood that this offer had no way back. From this moment on, every choice carried consequences. consequences, and the truth had knocked on his door, patiently waiting for him to decide whether it would be allowed to live. Marcus Hale received the report in a sealed conference room, where the glass was thicker than necessary and every call was recorded. The screen in front of him displayed F's summary of the rainy night, the altered route, and the ambulance that failed to complete its journey as originally planned. He finished reading, set the tablet down, his expression unchanged. "So the vehicle still ran," he said evenly, without surprise. An assistant stood across from him, keeping a safe distance. "Yes," the person replied. "The patient survived. There was an intervention at an off-route garage." Marcus lifted his gaze, his eyes passing over the assistant like they would over a number. "That's fine," he said. "Killing is the last option." He leaned forward, placing his hand on the table. "When the last option fails, we use something else." He dialed a number without searching his contacts. Harlan answered quickly, as if he had been waiting. "Get rid of that mechanic," Marcus said, without introduction or explanation. "Clean." On the other end, Harlan was silent for a beat. "What about the girl?" he asked, his voice low. Marcus paused, just long enough to choose his words. "Hospitals understand what delay means," he replied. "They have understood it for a long time." The call ended. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking out through the glass wall. The city below continued to function in its familiar rhythm. Cars flowing in lines, traffic lights changing on schedule. He knew what he controlled was not people, but process. Process required no emotion, only signatures and time. On the other side of the city, Leroy stood in a hospital corridor, his hand gripping a folder bag tightly. His daughter had just been taken in for additional tests, requested by the cardiology department. The familiar smell of disinfectant made him uneasy. He watched the gurney disappear behind the door, trying to read the nurse's expressions, but they avoided his eyes as if afraid to say something too soon. He sat down on a plastic bench, staring at the white wall in front of him. The wall clock ticked steadily. Each sound stretched his worry a little further. When the doctor stepped out, Leroy stood up immediately. "What are the results?" he asked. The doctor closed the door, lowering his voice. "We need to review some indicators," he said. "The surgery may have to be postponed." Leroy felt his stomach tighten. "Postponed how long?" he asked. The doctor shook his head. "Undetermined," he replied. "There are some procedures that need to be completed." "What procedures?" Leroy pressed. The doctor glanced down the corridor, then back at him. "Risk reassessment," he said. "Reapproval of the surgical schedule. Those things take time." Leroy nodded, but it felt as though an invisible hand were tightening around his throat. Not a human hand, but words, stamps, and meetings he was never invited to. He returned to the bench, his head lowered. The image of Eleanor and the file surfaced in his mind. He remembered what she had said about the system, about how silence was where it was strongest. He needed no further proof to understand what was happening. This delay was not random. His phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Leroy stared at it for a moment, as if opening it would make everything clearer, or worse. He did not open it right away. He looked toward the examination room where his daughter lay, the light inside dimly spilling through the crack in the door. Elsewhere, Marcus Hale was signing off on a stack of documents. His signatures looked neat and consistent. He paused at one file, skimmed it, then sighed, and moved on. Harlan sent a message confirming the instruction had been carried out. Marcus did not reply. He did not need confirmation of the obvious. He called someone else, his tone calm. "I need a reassessment schedule," he said. "According to procedure." The voice on the other end responded with familiar terminology, phrases worn smooth by repetition. Marcus listened, then ended the call. He knew everything was falling into place. At the hospital, Leroy stood up and walked down the corridor, trying to find a clearer answer. A young nurse stopped when she saw him. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Leroy looked at her. "I just want to know," he said, "whether the surgery will be cancelled." The nurse hesitated. "No," she replied, "but it may be rescheduled. I'm sorry." "For what reason?" Leroy asked. The nurse lowered her head. "I'm not allowed to say," she said softly. I'm just following instructions. Leroy nodded, thanked her, and returned to the bench. That answer confirmed what he had already thought. He opened his phone. The message was short, with no extra words. Don't do anything foolish. Leroy stared at the line, feeling his heartbeat accelerate. Another message arrived immediately after. If you stay quiet, everything will return to normal. Leroy turned off the screen, his hand clenching so tightly his knuckles turned white. Normal, he asked himself. Back to the old garage, signing altered timesheets, lowering his head before cold remarks. Back to waiting for every call from the hospital, afraid each time. That normal had never been safe. He looked up at the hospital ceiling, where fluorescent lights cast an even glow. This system did not need to shout at him. It only needed to stretch time, day by day, procedure by procedure. It turned life into a file waiting to be processed. In the conference room, Marcus Hale stood up and adjusted his chair. He looked around the empty room, then turned off the lights. He did not feel victory or defeat. He only knew he had shifted to a more suitable tact. When violence drew attention, procedure was the safer path. Leroy stood when the nurse told him his daughter had finished her tests. He followed them into the room, held her hand, and tried to smile. She looked at him, her eyes tired but still trying. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked. Leroy nodded. "I'm here," he said. "Everything will be fine." He knew those words had no proof yet, but he also knew he was facing another choice, no less cruel. The messages from the unknown number were still there, a reminder that someone was watching his every step. And in that moment, Leroy understood more clearly than ever that the one behind it all did not need to act. He only needed to wait. Night settled over Birmingham slowly and thickly, carrying a heaviness unlike ordinary evenings. In the small house, the living room light was still on, but Leroy was not watching anything. He stood beside the table, the phone lying motionless in front of him like a foreign object. After many days of waiting, avoiding, and anticipating, this moment had finally arrived in the coldest way possible. The screen lit up. A short message appeared, with no extra words, no excess characters. "Stay silent, or lose your child." Leroy stared at the line of text. The light from the screen reflected on his face, revealing the deep fatigue etched in after many sleepless nights. He did not blink. The words stood still, but their meaning moved rapidly in his mind, slamming into every thought. The phone vibrated again, as if to make sure the message had been received. This time, it was a call from the hospital. Leroy picked up almost immediately. "Hello," he said, his voice hoarse. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice sounded, kept neutral, exactly to the standard of a professional call. "Hello, Mr. Jenkins," the voice said. "We need to notify you regarding your child's surgery schedule." Leroy tightened his grip on the phone. "Yes," he replied. "What's going on?" There was a brief pause, long enough to make his heart constrict. "Your child's heart surgery," the voice continued, "has been postponed indefinitely." The final words were spoken more slowly, as if the speaker fully understood their weight. Leroy took a step toward the window, looking out into the darkness. "For what reason?" he pressed, trying to keep his voice steady. On the other end of the line, the silence stretched on for too long. That silence was frighteningly familiar. Finally, the voice returned. "Procedure," it said briefly. "We will contact you again when there is an update." The call ended. Leroy stared at the phone in his hand for another second, then threw it onto the table. The dry sound of impact echoed in the quiet room. He stood there, both hands braced on the tabletop, head lowered. The message and the call fit together perfectly, in the way only those skilled in manipulation could manage. He walked toward the bedroom. The door opened softly. His daughter lay on the bed, familiar wires and machines surrounding her. A small lamp beside the bed cast a gentle light, softening the sterile atmosphere of a temporary hospital brought into the home. Leroy pulled the chair closer and sat down beside the bed, listening to the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Each beat sounded fragile, yet persistent. He reached out and gently touched his daughter's small hand. Her skin was warm, but her breathing was somewhat labored. Leroy leaned closer, forcing his face to remain calm. In his mind, Eleanor's words echoed, about the system, about silence being paid for. Now he understood more clearly than ever the price of speaking out. The girl stirred, then opened her eyes. Her gaze was tired, but she recognized him immediately. "Dad, you're worrying again, aren't you?" she asked, her voice weak but clear. That simple question pierced straight through the defenses Leroy had tried to build. He swallowed hard and forced a smile. "It's okay," he said. "Dad's just sitting here for a bit." She looked at him for a moment, as if reading the things he did not say. She squeezed his hand lightly, a small but deliberate movement. "Don't worry, Dad," she said. "I'm okay." Leroy nodded, but inside his chest, a wave of emotion surged, difficult to control. He looked at her face, the familiar features that reminded him of his late wife. He remembered all the previous times he had sat beside hospital beds, each time telling himself they only had to get through one more. But this time was different. This time, his child's life was being placed on the scale like a clause, a bargaining tool. Leroy stood up, stepped out of the room, and closed the door. He leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, two paths appeared more clearly than ever. One path led to silence, to withdrawing from everything, allowing the system to swallow the truth whole, in exchange for the chance that his child would receive surgery and live. The other path led to the courtroom, to the harsh light of exposure, and to the risk of losing the most precious thing in his life. He returned to the living room and picked up the phone. The message was still there. "Stay silent, or lose your child." Leroy read it again, this time not to understand, but to remember. He thought of Marcus Hale, of the way he spoke about procedures and delays as if they were harmless concepts. He thought of Harlan, of the garage, of silent bows of the head. The phone vibrated again, but this time it was a different call. Eleanor. Leroy looked at the name on the screen, hesitated for a second, then answered. "They've made their move," he said before she could speak. "My child's surgery has been postponed." On the other end of the line, Eleanor was silent for a moment. "I know," she said. "He's pressuring you." Leroy closed his eyes. "He gave me a choice," he said. "Silence or lose my child." "That's not a choice," Eleanor replied. "That's blackmail." Leroy let out a dry laugh. "Call it whatever you want," he said. "The result is the same." "You're not alone," Eleanor said, "but I can't decide for you." Leroy leaned back in the chair. "I know," he replied. "I just need to know one thing. If I go to court, will he stop?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. "He won't stop," she said at last. "But if you stay silent, he'll continue, and not just with you." Leroy exhaled heavily. "And my child?" he said. "If I go to court, what happens to my child?" "We'll do everything we can," Eleanor replied, "but I won't lie to you. The risk is real." The call ended. Leroy set the phone down, stood up, and walked back toward the bedroom once more. He opened the door, stepped inside, and sat again beside his daughter's bed. The heart monitor continued its steady sound, a rhythm both fragile and resilient. He held her hand, feeling the weak but warm grip. She opened her eyes again, as if sensing the change in the air. She looked at him, then whispered, her voice small but each word clear. "My heart is weak," she said, "but you're not." Leroy lowered his head, his forehead resting lightly against her hand. Those words carried no understanding of courtrooms, procedures, or power. They carried only a child's simple faith in the one person she relied on. And that very simplicity caused something inside Leroy to change. He lifted his head, his eyes different now. No more confusion, no more avoidance, only the cold clarity of a decision slowly taking shape. The night remained thick, but in his mind, a line had been drawn, and wherever the road ahead might lead, he knew he could no longer return to where he had been. The night stretched longer than usual, not because the clock was running slow, but because Leroy could not sleep. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a night lamp casting softly against the wall, just enough to reveal his daughter's face as she slept. He sat on a low chair beside the bed, his back slightly hunched from exhaustion, yet his eyes remained open, following every small breath in front of him. His hand rested on her chest, clearly feeling the faint but steady rise and fall. Each breath was a reminder. The heart monitor emitted dry, regular beeps, even and cold, like a countdown clock without hands. That sound did not allow him to forget, nor did it allow him to retreat. Outside, the city had fallen asleep. Streetlights filtered through the crack in the window as blurred streaks. Leroy sat still, letting time pass through him. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It no longer made his hands tremble or caused him to avoid things. It forced him to look directly at what he had once tried to bury deep. The image of his wife surfaced without warning. A car accident, that was the phrase they used. A lightly rainy evening, a short phone call, A cold room in the morgue. He remembered the feeling clearly empty and numb. He also remembered how everything had been handled too quickly, too neatly. The file was closed before he had time to understand what had happened. A sentence echoed in his mind, the flat voice of the police officer from back then. No signs of criminal involvement. That sentence had once given him a reason to keep living, to believe that some things were simply accidents. Now, in this quiet night, the sentence felt different. It no longer carried reassurance, but instead felt like a rushed stamp pressed onto the truth. Leroy closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The air in the room was cool and still, yet his chest felt heavy. He thought of Marcus Hale, of the way he spoke about delay as if it were a technical procedure. He thought of Harlan, of the old garage, of the rainy night, and the ambulance that had been sabotaged just enough to cause death without raising suspicion. Everything connected itself in a cold, orderly pattern. He opened his eyes and looked at his daughter once more. She shifted slightly, her small hand moving faintly. Leroy leaned down and adjusted the blanket. "Sleep," he whispered, even though he knew she could not hear him. His voice was hoarse, but steady. He stood up and left the room slowly, so as not to wake her. The living room was submerged in darkness. Leroy walked to the corner of the house, where an old tool cabinet stood against the wall. That cabinet had followed him since his earliest days as a mechanic, dented and scratched, yet never discarded. He opened the cabinet door, and the familiar smell of metal and engine oil spread out, evoking the years when he believed that working hard was enough. He rummaged through the bottom drawers, the ones rarely used. Old tools, broken parts, things he kept out of habit more than necessity. At the bottom of the tool bag, his hand touched something small and hard. He pulled out a sealed plastic bag, slightly crumpled, its edge tightly taped shut. Leroy looked at the plastic bag in his hand, the weak light reflecting off its dull surface. Inside was the brake-locking bolt, small and heavy, carrying the traces of that rainy night. He clearly remembered the moment he picked it up from a drain near the garage, just as everything had ended. At the time, he did not know why he kept it. It was simply professional instinct, a hunch that this thing should not be washed away. He gently turned the bag, seeing clearly the reverse wrench marks still etched into the metal, wear marks familiar to anyone who had ever handled tool says he had. It did not belong to an accident. It belonged to the hands of someone who had worked very carefully. Leroy tightened his grip on the plastic bag, feeling the metal edge press into his skin. The sound of the heart monitor echoed from the bedroom, steady and unforgiving. Leroy stood there in the quiet house, one hand holding evidence, the other resting on his chest. He understood clearly that from this moment on, nothing would remain vague. The road ahead had taken shape, whether he wanted it or not. He returned to the bedroom and sat down beside his daughter's bed. The night lamp still glowed softly, her face peaceful in deep sleep. Leroy placed the plastic bag on the small table next to the bed, where he could see it. He rested his hand on her chest once more, listening to the steady heartbeat, fragile yet persistent. "I'm here," he said softly, more like a promise than reassurance. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. The trial, testimony, scrutinizing eyes, cold procedures. He also knew very well that Marcus Hale and people like him would not remain still. But on this night, when everything was paused, Leroy felt a clarity he had never known before. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. It stepped aside, making room for something else, a decision that had been forming for a long time, but only now had become clear enough to be named. He lowered his head and whispered, his voice low but firm, as if speaking to himself more than to anyone else. "This time, I'm not staying silent anymore." The courtroom that morning was not as noisy as people usually imagine a major trial to be. There was no shouting, no chaos. Everything unfolded neatly and in order, exactly the way the system operates when it is confident that it holds the upper hand. Leroy sat in the witness section, his back straight, both hands resting on his thighs. The sealed plastic bag lay inside his briefcase, lightly touching his knee like a heavy reminder. Marcus Hale entered the courtroom with his legal team, carrying the composed air of someone accustomed to rooms like this. He nodded to a few familiar faces on the panel, his gaze passing over Leroy for a very brief second, long enough to register his presence, but not long enough to reveal any emotion. To Marcus, this trial was a process to be handled, nothing more. Marcus's lawyer was the first to stand. He adjusted his glasses, opened a thick file, and spoke in a steady voice that carried through the enclosed space. According to the testimony of Mr. Harlan Vance, he read, Leroy Jenkins acted on his own to repair the ambulance for personal gain, disregarding regulations and explicit warnings. The wording was carefully chosen, enough to conjure the image of an opportunist exploiting a moment of chaos. Harlan sat in the front row, his head lowered, his hands clasped together. When asked to stand and confirm his statement, he trembled just enough to resemble a man under pressure. I forbade him, Harlan said, his voice hoarse, but he didn't listen. He said he would fix it if I paid him more. Harlan paused, taking a deep breath, as if continuing required great effort. Marcus turned to look at Leroy, this time for longer. His gaze carried the cold certainty of someone who believed every escape route had been sealed. He is not trustworthy, Marcus said, his voice low and clear. He had personal motives, and he violated procedure. A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom, then quickly died down when the judge raised her hand. She turned to Leroy, her expression stern. Mr. Jenkins, she said, you have heard the allegations. Do you have anything to say? Leroy stood up. The chair made a small sound, clearly audible in the quiet room. He did not look at Marcus right away. He looked straight at the judge. Yes, he said. His voice was so calm that several people in the room hesitated slightly. It was not the voice of a man cornered, but of someone who had prepared for this moment. He stepped toward the witness table, opened his briefcase, and took out the sealed plastic bag. His movements were slow, unhurried, as if he wanted every eye to have time to follow. He placed the plastic bag on the wooden table, the soft contact sound clear enough to be heard. Marcus's lawyer frowned. Objection, he said. We were not notified of this evidence. The judge raised her hand. Mr. Jenkins, she said. What is that? Leroy looked down at the plastic bag. A brake-locking bolt, he replied. I picked it up from a drain near the garage on the night the ambulance was disabled. He opened the bag, carefully removed the bolt, and placed it on the metal tray in front of everyone. The courtroom lights shone down, clearly revealing the abnormal wear marks along its surface. What does that prove? Marcus's lawyer asked, his voice less certain than before. Leroy lifted his head, his eyes turning directly toward Marcus for the first time. It proves the vehicle did not fail because of an accident, he said. Another wave of murmurs spread through the room, this time harder to contain. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. Order, she said, then turned back to Leroy. Explain further. Leroy picked up the bolt, turning it slightly so the markings were visible. This bolt was turned in reverse, he said. Not from impact. The wear marks show it was removed and reinstalled using specialized tools. He paused for a beat, allowing the next statement to land. Those tools match the type approved in the logistics budget of Vance Motors. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, very subtly, but not enough to escape the notice of those watching closely. His lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection, he said loudly. This is speculation. No, Leroy said, his voice still even. This is a technical comparison. He turned to the judge. I have worked as a mechanic for 10 years. I know tool marks. He looked back at Marcus. And I know who has the authority to approve those tools. The air in the courtroom thickened. Harlan lowered his head even further, his shoulders now visibly shaking. Marcus's lawyer flipped through his files rapidly, searching for a new foothold. Mr. Jenkins, he said, you are trying to blame an executive with a single bolt pulled from a drain. Leroy nodded. Yes, he said, a single bolt, the smallest part in this entire system. But it was enough to stop an ambulance. He paused, looking around the courtroom, and enough to kill a person. It's not. The judge remained silent, her eyes fixed on the piece of evidence. Mr. Harlan, she said, do you confirm anything about this bolt? Harlan lifted his head, his lips trembling. He looked at Marcus, then lowered his gaze again. He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched on, heavy enough for everyone to feel. Marcus said nothing. His face still held its composed expression, but the hand resting on the table had tightened into a fist. The things he believed were secure, the procedures, the system were beginning to be dragged into the light by the very logic he had once used to conceal them. Leroy stood there without adding another word. He had said enough. The empty plastic bag lay on the table, the small bolt at its center like a period that could not be erased. The courtroom sank into a silence as heavy as lead, a silence that signaled everything had just changed, and that no one in this room could pretend any longer that this was merely an ordinary trial. The courtroom was still submerged in a dense silence as the judge looked down at the witness stand, then turned her gaze toward the prosecution. The brake-retaining bolt lay exposed under the lights, small yet impossible to ignore. The judge gave a slight nod, a gesture almost no one noticed, but enough to redirect the machinery. Two police officers rose from the back row. They walked toward Harlan with decisive steps. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice," one of them said clearly, his hand moving to the handcuffs. Harlan jerked his head up, his face turning pale for a moment before twisting. "I was just following orders," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I didn't decide anything." Murmurs erupted, no longer restrained. Marcus Hale sprang up from his seat, losing his composure for the first time. "You people don't understand this system," he said loudly, his voice mixed with anger and panic. Everything was legitimate. Everything followed procedure. He looked around, as if searching for a familiar face to cling to. The prosecutor stood, his voice cold and precise. "We understand," he said, "and that is the problem." He stepped forward. The system was used to delay emergency response, manipulate transport routes, and interfere with federal medical procedures. That is not an error. That is a conspiracy. Marcus turned to his lawyer, but no answer came in time. Files were passed hand to hand, glances exchanged. The judge nodded again. "Mr. Marcus Hale," she said, "you are being detained pending investigation for federal medical fraud and conspiracy to commit murder." Two more officers approached. Handcuffs number 8 snapped shut around Marcus's wrists, the dry clack of metal echoing in the room. He struggled for a brief moment, then went still. His face no longer showed anger, only emptiness. The system he had trusted had just turned its back on him, the way it always did to those who were no longer useful. Leroy stood at the witness position, his arms hanging loose, his breathing slowing. He did not feel victorious. He only felt a weight lift from his shoulders, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. Eleanor sat behind him, watching. She gave a very slight nod, not as congratulations, but as confirmation. Everything had been said. The hearing was adjourned temporarily to handle urgent procedures. The courtroom gradually emptied. Leroy stepped into the hallway, daylight pouring in through the high windows. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. The sounds of handcuffs, the gavel, and the murmurs still echoed in his mind, but they were fading. His phone vibrated in his pocket. The hospital number. Leroy answered immediately. "Mr. Jenkins." The voice on the other end sounded more urgent than before. "We have received renewed approval for the surgery schedule. Your daughter is being taken into the operating room now." Leroy closed his eyes, a long breath escaping him. "I'm on my way," he said. He left the courthouse and stepped outside. The sky was bright, sunlight falling on the cold stone steps. At the same time, in another room of the building, Marcus Hale was led away, head bowed, wrists cuffed. No one called him by his title anymore. Only clauses remained, waiting to be unraveled. At the hospital, Leroy ran down the familiar corridor. His daughter lay on the gurney, her small face under the white lights. The nurse made final checks, and the doctor exchanged quick words. Leroy took his daughter's hand. "Dad is here," he said. She looked at him and gave a weak smile. "I know," she replied. The gurney was wheeled away. Leroy followed to the doors of the operating room, then stopped. The large, cold doors closed after she was taken inside. He stood there, hands clasped together, staring at the indicator light above. The hallway was quiet, with only the fading sound of doctors' shoes. Elsewhere, Eleanor stood before a glass wall overlooking the city. Her phone vibrated continuously, calls from the board of directors, from the press, from oversight committees. She did not answer right away. She knew this story was not finished here, but at least one truth had made it past silence. Leroy sat down in a waiting chair, his back against the wall. The tension that had built up over many days slowly dissolved, revealing deep fatigue. He thought about the old garage, about 10 years of silence, about the rainy night and the decision made in the dark. He thought about the small bolt that had changed everything. A nurse passed by, looked at him, and offered an encouraging smile. Leroy nodded in return, but his eyes never left the operating room doors. Time moved slowly, each minute stretching. Every small sound made him look up. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor signed the first documents. The case expanded, pulling in other names, other contracts. Harlan was led away separately, his face lowered. The system began to bite into itself, the way it always did when light was shone directly upon it. Leroy stood when he saw the doctor walk out from the far end of the hallway. The doctor removed his mask, his eyes still holding professional focus. "We are proceeding," the doctor said. "Everything is going according to plan." Leroy nodded and asked nothing further. He understood that, at this moment, no question would help. He returned to his seat and sat down, hands resting on his knees. In his mind, his daughter's words echoed, simple and steady. He did not know what the outcome would be, but he knew he had stood upright when it mattered. The light above the operating room doors changed color. A green glow came on, clear and decisive. Leroy jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. He stared at that light, as if it were telling him something beyond language. Outside, the city continued. Cars passed, people went to work and came home, as if nothing had changed. But for Leroy, and for his daughter, everything was being decided in this moment. Do you believe justice always arrives late, or only arrives when someone dares to stand upright? Comment and follow so you do not miss the ending. The green light remained on. Behind those doors, the fate of a child and of a man who chose not to remain silent was being decided.